I'm gonna go over some basics. People who watch our stuff all the time, it's probably repetitious, but we find that most of our videos are viewed on an individual basis. So a lot of people will watch one video and come back maybe a long time later, but they're always asking, why don't we explain stuff a little bit more? Some people tell me to shut up, that they hate hearing me talk, but I'm gonna take you back to basics, and I'll talk, kind of like show you like what we do when we try to train someone like a new employee. So when we're coming to our gluing to glue our sew foam on, obviously wherever you cut your sew foam, you're gonna want to cut it where your seam's gonna be. This way you don't have to worry about gluing it. And we do glue it together perfect, but you don't want to worry about anything showing through your material, because when we do a 1/4 inch sew foam over the top of this seat, we're gonna put the vinyl on this one with nothing else on it. So it's gonna be smooth vinyl sewn together and just pulled over here. So when we glue it on, we're just using an inexpensive gun that we got from like one of the discount stores. It's like an old Big 7 from back in the day, style. We just pull like half throttle on, half trigger. And you want a nice, even, wet coat. You don't want to get it like really wet where it's like that, where it's like absorbs in. Get it, basically any of the solvents that are in the glues, if you get really wet and bloppy, they're going to try to evaporate. So you might lay this down and it might look nice, but then as the solvents release, it could actually blister and bubble up and look horrible. So what I like to do is give it a nice, even, semi-wet coat. So it's absorbing into the material, but it's not like wet. Glued this. I like to glue both pieces and let them completely dry and then do a tack coat. So I'll put a real light coat on here. Real light, just to kind of reactivate the glue. Because you can, on certain things, you could glue your stuff together and then you can steam it and that will rebond it. But you can't, it's a waste steaming this. So now we're just going to go through, just a little over. We want it to come down. And you'll notice I just leave it long here, and the reason I'm doing that is because even though it's a fiberglass pan and we rounded the edges, I want to make sure that there's an extra barrier for protection, and also that little bit of 1/4 inch sew foam will help it to look better if there's an issue, if there's like a tiny piece of foam or something like that that gets caught in there, or anything. It just will give you a nice edge around it. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through and glue the edge on the inside of the seat pan, right around the edge. Just trimming the edges. I want to have a nice crisp edge around it. Anywhere there might be any bumps, we're just going to cut little V's in here. So we don't want any bumps around these edges at all. We want the sew foam to be nice and smooth right around the edge. I tell you, these razor blades seem like they get worse and worse every year. Okay, it's trimmed up. And we're going to pattern. We're at the patterning stage, so anybody who's watched our previous videos, they're going to know the drill. We're going to mark our center points always, which since we made this pan, they're still on there. Any fabrication work you do, I don't care what it is, woodworking, metalworking, upholstery, you always have to find your center points and work your way out. We're going to begin masking this. We said it in the past, there's a million ways to do patterns. You just find when you're training people, masking tape is actually kind of easy. When you do material and you lay it over and you try to pattern it, a lot of times the material doesn't fall where they need to, and then you're missing like, you might have a gap between the front and rear. So the tape's a good way to keep it together. We do find that you have to be careful because you could tape it in a curve, and when you pull it off, if you don't put the lay the tape as if it was a flat piece of paper, when you go to pattern it, there's some guesswork in there, and we don't like that. So here we go. For those of you who watch our videos and pay attention, I know what you're thinking. I always only mask off one side of the bike, use that as a pattern, flip it over and make it symmetrical. This bike I know is not symmetrical because there's stuff on one side of the bike I had to extend to hide some wiring and stuff. So I know the pan's not going to be exact. It's a little off, not going to be noticeable. However, I want to make sure I have enough material to cover that. Also, this seat is a perfect example of, we're talking about rolling edges and different materials and how they work in the past. This seat here is, believe it or not, it's a simple seat, but it's challenging. If you have a stretchy material, it's really easy because you just stretch it around all these rounded edges. If you have a stiff material, which is what we're using a vintage distressed. It's a very heavy hard to bend, it doesn't stretch vinyl or imitation leather. You know, like if you look at our stitches here, I know this is this basic stitch pattern I'm gonna do. I do like on this specific seat when you stretch the material over and it has a smooth look to it. It's a little more sporty looking. The problem is the material that we're working with, we can't do that. There's just no, by the time I get done stretching this and pulling this, we're gonna have to, well, it doesn't even heat really well. I just know it's not gonna look right around the corners. So I'm gonna put a stitch here to match kind of this stitch here. And it's just gonna come around here. This will allow us to have this material here. We'll have a nice stitch with a nice top stitch on there. This material is just gonna be, it's a black material, it's coal they call it, so it's a distressed black. So we're just gonna do a black thread on here. Now the front of these seats, you'll see I have a challenge too. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Like I said before, the stretchy vinyl, you could actually stretch it over. And in those cases, believe it or not, it's easier to pattern with that vinyl on here than it is to do the tape. Because this tape, like I said before, is going to have an issue because we wrap the tape around here, and even though I try to keep it straight as if it was vinyl, it's still wrapped around here kind of weird. That's gonna be a little wacky, and we're gonna have to kind of deal with that. So what I'm gonna do is, even though we're marking the bottom where it stops, we're going to leave the material long. We're gonna pin the cover on like you've seen me do in the past, and this way we can kind of stretch it and get it exactly where we want it. Then we're gonna trim around it and make our bottom piece, and then we'll sew that on. And also, because one of our subscribers had actually asked about installation of a seat and how we do it, we're gonna go through and show you exactly how to install this specific seat, how we do it. I took our patterns off the seat and I just placed them on here, and I kind of wanted to show you, if you don't follow the contours of the material, you could see that the material doesn't really, the tape doesn't really stretch here. So you can see that it's extra material here that would normally have to stretch around here. And this is the stuff that a lot of people get confused at, and it gets tricky sometimes. One way I like to do it is, I'll take my pattern that I know has to be right up here. We're gonna take our pattern that we cut. And all we did is simply mark it on the seat where we want it to, and then just cut right around there, and that's the pattern. That's our exact pattern. Now, with that cut, that just gives us the exact edge where our stitch is gonna be. Now you need to have your savage, which we usually do about 3/8 of an inch. I'm just gonna measure 3/8 of an inch out here, and we'll do the same thing on the other pattern. So when we stitch it, we're stitching right in this line, but this is where the end of the savage will be. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make sure this is good. I actually left this long. And one thing that you always wanna make sure is you wanna make sure the stretch of the material is going in the proper direction for what you're doing. I know that I need this material to stretch forward more than I do sideways. And the same thing with the back. Because of these weird curves here, we need the material to stretch around here, and we don't want it to stretch left or right. We want it to stretch front to back. So now we have our stretch over material going front to back. Just gonna go through and do our 3/8 of an inch around all of our patterns. And then, as you can see here, I only did half of our pattern really well. The other pattern I just did like this because I want to make sure when we fold it over, we have enough material, because like I said earlier in the previous video, the seat that we're doing is not symmetrical, whereas most of our seats are. This seat, we had to cover some wiring on the side of it, so it's a little bit longer. So now when we fold this over, we'll make sure that we are extended to the end of our lines that we needed. All right, so I'm just gonna put the pieces we cut out onto the foam here, onto the seat. Just wanna make sure everything's gonna line up. Across our savage, make sure our stitch is there. We got our extra material here. Everything's worked out good. All right, this looks like it's gonna work. I am going to, we have to cut out our alignment V. So you see me, I put these random check marks in here. If you watch some of our previous videos on patterning, you put these marks in here, and we put little V's in them, which I'll show you, and which is just basically a little V, you can see there. And now that just lines up with the corresponding piece that you're sewing to, so you make sure that when they come around, they all line up in the right place. So this is good. You can see I left all the material long on all the sides that we need, because we're gonna pull it, stretch it, and pin it, just because I wanna make sure that this doesn't have too much material. And you see here how it puckers up like that. So that's why we put our stretch going this way. So now we're gonna stretch it, and I'll be able to mark right around there. I'm gonna sew this together here. If you take a look, just want to show you, you see the marks that you put on here to line up, these little V's that you have to line up together. So we're just going to start off, and I'll show you here. You can see as you're sewing, you got your bottom notches and your top notches. You just want to make sure you line those up together and kind of go around. So we're going to go around the corner here. Now on tight corners, a lot of times you could actually trim the edges so it kind of rolls around a little bit better. And you just want to make sure that all your V's end up lining up as you go. So now that we have this, you can see the Savage here, this little flap here. And a lot of car upholstery people will leave the Savage on there, but for the motorcycles, we're going to trim it off. I'll show you why. You gotta be real careful here. You don't want to hit a stitch. So the reason that you'll trim this, you see, if you don't trim it here and you trim it here, when you put it inside and you pull your seat around, where it's trimmed, you don't see an edge, but where it's not trimmed, you see that edge there. We don't want to see that. I went through and pinned up the seat here. We're just gonna put the cover on.